I'm Sarah Schattschneider, and today I'm going to be talking about Airflow and some best practices around it. A little bit about myself before we dive into the presentation. I'm a software engineer at Blue Apron. I am on the data operations team, so we are in charge of our data pipeline, which mainly involves ingesting data and events into our data warehouse and making sure that's available for our downstream stakeholders. And I have been working with Airflow for about 2 years at Blue Apron. And my key interests in it are performing ETL workflows, so making sure we're ingesting the right data. So if we work with a company to send out our weekly surveys to get our net promoter scores, trying to get that data into our data warehouse so that our analytics team and other teams can make smarter decisions around that. Other key things that we do at Blue Apron with Airflow are we actually set up our BigQuery permissioning, which is the Google Cloud solution for the data warehouse, programmatically using their API, which is very interesting. And also, I really like testing in Airflow, so I'll be touching upon that today as well. Great. Today we're going to go through some background just to make sure everyone's on the same page about some key concepts, then go into Airflow-specific concepts, talk about evaluating Airflow, any challenges with it and how to overcome those, and then finally going into some use cases and best practices. Great. So before I begin, I would actually like to understand who the audience members are and your familiarity with Airflow so I can make sure we're highlighting the right things throughout the presentation. So please raise your hand if you are new to Airflow. All right, great to know. And how many of you work with Airflow regularly? Cool. All right, so we'll definitely be diving into some best practices and cooler use cases for people who are familiar, but laying the whole groundwork for everyone who's new to Airflow. All right, so this is a cron tab. Some of you may recognize it, some of you may not. Depends how long you've been in the industry. We will dive into more about the scheduling part on the left-hand side, so that 0, 1, star, star, star. I'll explain what that means later in the presentation. But basically, a cron tab allows you to run a specific command or script, which is on the right-hand side, at a given time, which is the left-hand side. And that will be a repeated task that will get scheduled. So you might be wondering, why do we want to move away from cron into a world that is Airflow? So cron, before I started at Blue Apron, I heard some horror stories from my coworkers that they actually had to have an email send every half hour as a task was running to snapshot our databases to know it was running properly. And to know that it wasn't working, they had to realize the email stopped showing up. So we all can see that that is not an ideal case for alerting on failures. So Airflow takes the same type of scheduling, but makes it a lot more extensible with the logging, monitoring, and alerting right off the bat. But you're able to continue running your specific tasks at a certain time. All right, before we dive into Airflow specific, I want to get us all on the same page about a directed acyclic graph called a DAG. So here you will see the letters are nodes, and then you have a dependency structure that is created by the arrows here. So let's figure out a little bit more about what this means. As a foodie, we are going to talk about chocolate cake and what it means to get a chocolate cake into the oven. So first, you need to get a bowl. Then you need to put the proper ingredients in the bowl. You will mix the ingredients together to make sure you get the right consistency. Separately, you're going to prepare a cake pan so that you're ready to put the batter in the cake pan. And then finally, you're going to put it into the oven. So what does this DAG gain us? By having the acyclic nature, you start with getting a bowl and you end with putting the pan in the oven. And also, the dependency structure is really important to highlight. So when we get to the step of put cake batter into pan, we know that we've already done everything upstream. It has been met. So the assumption that our batter is in the proper consistency and has the right ingredients, that has been met. And we know that everything we want to do in that step is going to be safe. All right, so let's get into some core concepts to Airflow and figure out what is Airflow and why you should be interested in working with it. So a little bit more about Airflow. Airflow was open sourced by Airbnb in 2015. It is a way to programmatically author workflows. So all of this is written in Python. The DAG and the hooks and operators, which I will touch upon shortly, are all Python. How I was discussing with the DAG, you have stateful scheduling. So you know that your tasks are only going to be only going to run when your assumptions have been met. So let's say you're doing an ETL job and you need to have data in one place to move it into your data warehouse, for instance. You're never going to go to get that data from your storage unless the file already exists. So you know you're safe to make that call. Airflow comes with a really rich CLI and user interface, which makes it really fun to develop. It's cool to debug things locally and get new workflows set up. You have the logging, monitoring, and alerting to know in production and staging. If something's going wrong, you can figure out the root cause faster and understand the root cause. Due to it being in a DAG, you have the tasks, which make it more testable. And with this, you're going to be able to be safer for upgrades, know if a teammate's going to work on your DAG in 2 years, they're going to understand the actual expected behavior through your tests, and that has been really helpful at Blue Apron. And finally, it solves a lot of common problems in batch processing, but it can go a lot further than that and get into some really cool other things. But mostly, we're going to talk about the data engineering ecosystem today. Great. So this is a DAG. This is a very simple hello world DAG. You might not recognize this as Pythonic right away. It is more boilerplate for the actual DAG. Your hook and operator, which I will explain shortly, will be more Pythonic, and that's where you're going to definitely be using all best practices of Python. So here at the very top, we have a hello world, which is just returning a string that says hello world. Next, we have default args. What's important to highlight here is we have a start date of when the workflow should start running. We get to say when to email on failure, how many retries each of the tasks should have before going into a failed state, and how many max active runs. I'll dive into each of these a little bit further when evaluating Airflow. So next up, you see we have DAG equals DAG, example DAG, the default args, and the schedule interval. So here we are actually initializing our workflow. And below it, dag.docmd is for the markdown for our documentation on this DAG. And I'll highlight that a little bit more later in the presentation as well. Then we have a dummy operator. In this case, it's not necessary to have a dummy operator, but once you get to a DAG with we normally do it if it's even over 10 tasks, it's really helpful to create that DAG structure, and you can clear downstream. So I'll also expand on that in a little bit. And then finally, we have our Python operator, where we say the task ID, that's going to be what shows up in the UI. And then we are saying which Python callable. If it's a more complicated function, you can also give your args here and some other information. And we're saying that it's going to belong to the DAG we defined above as DAG. And at the very bottom, you see hello, and then the bit shift operator, start hello, and bit shift operator to hello. That's creating the dependency structure. So the start is going to be the first task, and hello will be the next task. And it is important to note, you can also have the markdown associated with each task, which will be able to give a high-level overview to someone else looking at your workflow in the future to know what is this task supposed to do. All right, so this is our DAG rendered in the UI. I'm going to point out a few important things here. So you'll see the start going to hello. So down there, those are our two tasks. With the green border around them, that means it's been successful. You can see the other states over here on the right. So dark green is success, light green is running, red is failed, and so forth. On the top right hand of the screen, you also see the schedule interval, so you know how often this is going to run. And then we have some different tabs into other views, which I'll highlight now. So two of them that I think it's worth mentioning for people who are new to Airflow that are very useful are the Gantt chart. So you can see what is currently running. The dark green means that it has already completed. It will be light green if it's currently running. And then on the right-hand side, we have task duration, which shows historically how long these tasks have taken. So why I wanted to highlight these two is if there's ever an error and something is running later than normal in your workflow, you can use these two graphs to give a better ETA to your downstream consumers of the data or the output of this process. All right, so now let's get into more of the really cool stuff in Airflow. We have hooks, operators, and tasks. So hooks are going to encapsulate all of your interactions with an API. And your operators are going to instantiate a hook or two and complete a goal. And finally, your task is going to be an instance of an operator. So let's make that a little bit more tangible and go back to our cake example. So a hook is going to be the cake pan and the oven. In here, we have everything you can do with each. So for an oven, you can preheat it to a specific temperature. You can open the door, close the door. For the cake pan, you can decide what type of pan. Is it a circle pan, square pan, whatever. You can prep the pan to be greased for your putting the batter in. And then for the operator, we have put cake pan in oven. So we will actually initialize two hooks, both the oven and the cake pan. And we're going to be able to use the functions with those hooks. So we will open the door from the oven, we will put the cake pan in, and so forth. Finally, the task is going to give the information about this specific instance of it. So we're going to say which oven to use, which cake pan to use, and which ingredients to use for the batter. And to connect this back to the DAG we saw at the very beginning, the task is a node in that DAG. So now, bringing it more to a real-world example, so we're going to talk about within the Google system. So we have Google Cloud Storage and Google BigQuery. Again, these are going to be utilizing the APIs there, so all operators that you need will be functions there. And then the operator will actually initialize the two hooks and complete the tasks. So for this example of taking a file from GCS and putting it into BigQuery, we are going to determine which source path to take, which we see on the task on the right-hand side here, which bucket that path is from, and which table and data set to go into. It will also have some other information about loading the data that is specific to this ingestion. So I just want to point out that Airflow is a really active community, so there are probably a lot of the hooks and operators already existing for your stack, so it will be pretty easy to transition to scheduling workflows in the Airflow ecosystem. One operator I would like to call out is the Python operator. You're, as we all are Python developers here, you're able to call a Python function within your DAG, and you're going to be able to still have the same alerting, monitoring within the Airflow ecosystem, but it's very extensible to change current processes into a DAG. Great, so let's get into evaluating Airflow. One thing I really appreciate about Airflow is the fact that it will retry errors elegantly. So at 3 in the morning, when you have that task that has to reach out to a service, and you get a 503 error, you're gonna not get called in the middle of the night, which is great, because you're going to be able to determine how many times it should retry that call, and hopefully it will get beyond that transient error, and you won't get called, which is great. Next, you can alert on failure in many different ways. So if you have people who need to be notified via email, Slack, you can also start to integrate with some on-call systems. And you can rerun a specific part of a DAG. So what this means is if you have a DAG with 20 tasks and 3 of them fail because the one upstream of it failed, so 4 total failed, we only have to rerun the one that failed and clear downstream. So that means of the 20 tasks, we're only rerunning 4, which is a huge time saver. And Airflow is able to support distributed execution, so multiple machines can work towards the same jobs as workers. And this is just a few of the third-party data integrations that already exist, many more, so definitely check out the Airflow repo. And then one other thing to highlight is the Cron scheduling. So before, when I introduced Cron and said that Airflow expanded upon Cron, one thing that Airflow kept was how extensible Cron scheduling is. So in the first example, 0, 4, ** 1 means the DAG will run Monday at 4 o'clock, and that will happen every month because the month is a star. For the second example here, we are actually able to say that it should run the 10th of the month at 10:05. And other things to highlight about cron scheduling, beyond being really flexible of determining when a DAG should run, it is also time zone safe, so it's in UTC. All right, does Airflow have an ugly side, and have we had any issues at Blue Apron with it? So one problem we've run into is upgrades are challenging, but this is due to the fact that we started using Airflow almost right after it was open sourced. So we ended up making a lot of custom hooks and operators because they didn't exist yet. And we are trying to mitigate that by obviously contributing upstream more, but also we have, in our staging environment, we have a DAG that has most of our operators and has representative data flowing through these workflows, so we can see which operators are going to have errors and be able to work through those errors faster. And then we also will have unit tests for all of our accompanying Python functions and our custom hooks and operators to be able to retest that with the upgrade. All right, an interesting concept within Airflow is data sharing. So there are 2 approaches that are specific to Airflow, and then 2 that you'll be familiar with as a Python developer. So the first one is XComs. This is Airflow's cross-communication. So in our example before, we had start and hello. But let's make it more exciting and add something that needs to ingest after hello, and we need to have the output from hello. So we can pull the return value from a previous function with an XCOM pull. So this is a way to have your tasks communicate with each other and still keep it modular of each task has one goal in mind. Another approach within Airflow is an Airflow variable. This will actually live in the database associated with Airflow. And I'm going to talk about some pros and cons to each of these solutions momentarily. So like normal Python variables, they should be used for working memory. And then finally, you also have environment variables for your system. So when it comes to traceability, the XCOM and the Python variables are going to have the most traceability because those are going to be in your code base and any change will be documented. The Airflow variable and environment variable are going to be less traceable, but it's an advantage to use an environment variable at times to be able to pass your secrets into your Airflow instance. So usernames and passwords that way. All right, so let's get into some common and fun use cases. So the most common one for us at Blue Apron is ETL. So Airflow just enables it to be very easy to move data between different places and be able to transform it as needed. And you're able to create custom hooks and operators, so when that new workflow comes up from another team, we're able to really easily act and help implement that. So an interesting concept within Airflow are subdags. So how we heard this morning, you should never copy and paste code. And so in this example, this is from the Airflow documentation, you'll see that there are 5 tasks which are going to be very similar code. The only thing that's changing here is the task ID, so like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and probably some other variables within it. So you can make this more efficient by using a subdag. A subdag will actually return another DAG, so you still get the same traceability, monitoring, and alerting, but you're able to have a nicer DAG at the high level. So one example where we use this at Blue Apron is snapshotting some of our Postgres databases. So the first task here will actually be a DAG that uses the Postgres operator and the GCS, that's Google Cloud Storage operator, to move the snapshot from Postgres of the current state into GCS. The next one is loading it from GCS into BigQuery, and finally moving it into the correct tables within BigQuery. So why we made these subdags is we're going to have different databases, and this is going to make it more reusable across the code base. Another fascinating thing to point out is the Slack integration. So the Slack API post operator, you're able to post to different channels. So let's say you have an ingestion that affects the marketing team, for instance. You're going to be able to alert them when it's completed or if there were any issues with it that they need to go update. One example of where we use the Slack operator at Blue Apron is within our BigQuery permissioning. So BigQuery is Google's warehouse solution, data warehouse solution. And so at the beginning, we want to alert our consumers of BigQuery that BigQuery's permissioning will be out for a moment, about like 5 minutes. And so they can expect these intermittent errors. And then at the end, we want to let them know it's back up and running. So if they paused any of their daily workflows, they're able to get right back to it. And then in between here, I just want to highlight that we're using the BigQuery API, which is in our BigQuery hook, to be able to create the data sets and date partition tables, the views, and then permission it programmatically so we know who gets access to which of the tables. And then another squad at Blue Apron is our ML squad, and they are also using Airflow for feature extraction. So they have one DAG for exporting the associated data from our data warehouse, and then they have another DAG that will pick up that data and use Spark to actually train the model and other predictions as well. All right, so getting into some best practices here. So testing. Testing is really cool. I think we can still improve a little bit more in Airflow on testing. But some really cool ways we're using it within Blue Apron is testing our supporting Python functions. So when I was talking about ETL workflows before, you're probably going to have some kind of Python function that's going to support the ETL process, the transforming of it. And so we want to make sure when you're transforming data, you know exactly what behavior you're expecting. And so a unit test is a great way to test that. We will also test our custom hooks and operators for the expected behavior. And one other cool thing to point out is that we have an integration test to use Airflow list DAGs. So those of you who are new to Airflow, Airflow list DAGs is a command to make sure all of your DAGs are compiling properly. And this is really important to run before deploying your system because maybe you created a new workflow and you need to create that connection ID in production that doesn't exist. Maybe there's some other error with the DAG. This is a way to catch that before you actually deploy to production. And finally, I want to talk about how documentation within Airflow is much easier than it ever was with Cron. So this is here a markdown template that we use at Blue Apron. We have 6 questions we like to answer about every workflow, so it's easier for on-call people to respond and also future developers in the workflow to understand more about what's happening. So we first have a DAG summary, really brief. What is this doing? Why? Why is it important? We go into if it's mission critical or not. This will help us understand if we should be alerting our on-call teammate in the middle of the night, or if this is okay to wait for the next morning. What to do on failure. Also, our points of contact downstream. So if there are any errors or problems that need to be worked through, we know who to contact faster. And then finally, some other resources that are helpful for the documentation. So this code will actually live in the code base right after you initialize the DAG. And then in the UI, it will render like any other markdown. So you're able to utilize full markdown capabilities when using your documentation, which is helpful to make it very pretty. Yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much. And I think we have some time for questions.
Hi, can you guys hear me? If you guys want to ask a question, can you just go to one of these mics right here? There's one on the other side as well. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for doing this talk. I had a question about how you guys do deployment and then like local test, like local development environment and stuff like that.
Yeah, great question. So this is deployed like any other apps at Blue Apron. So we use Kubernetes on an EC2 instance. So that all of the Airflow specific information lives within our Docker container, and then that is on the EC2 instance. So locally, we will bring up the Docker container and run it, and then Docker exec into it to be able to run the Airflow commands such as Airflow list DAGs or Airflow scheduler to run it locally.
Yeah, hi, really interesting. I'm always sort of curious about different like best practice methods for deploying DAGs in these situations, and there's a lot of choices. So I'm curious how you guys chose Airflow over like a Luigi or an Argo or other options. And then also, I'd be curious if you were at the Netflix talk yesterday, if you had thoughts about that in comparison to Airflow.
Great. So for your first question, I was not at Blue Apron when we made the decision, but I think a part of the decision was due to how our workflows fit really well into Airflow over Luigi. And I think it was also due to the fact that the Airflow community is so active, and we knew that we would be able to contribute and get updates. And then I was unfortunately unable to make the Netflix talk yesterday. I was at another talk. There were too many cool ones. So, yeah.
Hi, a quick question. Thank you for excellent talk, by the way. So when we're going to write the hooks and the operators, Subdags, and the tasks, like, can you talk about each and why and when?
Yeah. Okay, so if you are starting a new ETL process of, let's say, another department comes to you and says, hey, we have data coming in over here, or if it's a third party or whatnot. So most likely when we'll create a new hook is if we're working with a new third party that we don't have a hook for already. So when we're creating a hook, we're going to utilize either their API or SDK, Python SDK, to interact with their systems to get the necessary information. Then the hook is going to be for each goal we have with this workflow. So if we have a goal of moving data from one place to another, that's when we'll create an operator. If we're trying to transform it or do something within that hook, it would also be an operator whenever you need to initialize it. And then when using a subdag, so then a task will be to initialize the operator, so giving it the specifics around that. And then finally, the subdag part of your question, I would say using a subdag when you see repeated processes happening across different DAGs or within the same DAG, whenever copying and pasting code should definitely be a red flag like anywhere else in coding. Does that answer your question? Great. All right, any other questions?
So what do you do for workflows that are not triggered on a cron schedule or need to be a little bit more interactive?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and thank you for asking that. So the question was, what do you do for workflows that happen on a regular cadence, but not regular enough to be once a week, once a month, once a year, whatever it is? We will still have DAGs like that. So with the BigQuery permissioning that I talked about, that doesn't have a regular cadence to run, but you can go into the UI and schedule it to run one-off, so more of an ad hoc run of it. Does that answer your question? Great.
My question, I've done similar scheduling with Celery, and I've found that time zones are an issue. Do you use UTC? What time zone are you using, and what are your best practices?
Yeah, so we do use UTC. We also find that other engineering orgs, other engineering teams within the org will also be using UTC, so we haven't run into issues there. We do not use the Celery scheduler within Airflow, but there is an option for that, so that might be something to look into. Yeah, I think just sticking with UTC has worked well for us, and then you can have DAGs depend on other DAGs. So if you want one DAG to finish before another, you can have a task sensor, so that will run after it, so that might help with some time zone issues. Yeah.
Hi. So I'm data pipeline team adjacent, and I was curious if you have any input on an issue we have. We have a constant problem with bootstrapping our Airflow environment for new developers. We find ourselves constantly going into the UI itself to set up all the connection variables and all the other bits versus coming up with some sort of automated process. So I was curious to hear your thoughts if you've run into similar issues.
Yeah, so that's where we utilize the Docker container a little bit more to have an initializing script to get variables passed into it. And then we also have an init script that programmatically adds to the Airflow database. That's more for local development, but let's talk offline and we can continue this conversation.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.